Golov, Marketing and Communications Manager at Data Conversion Laboratory, and I will be your moderator today. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know we will allow time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers, so please write your questions in the chat area as they come to mind. If we don't have time to answer them all, we will make them available on our website. Next slide, please. For those of you who are not familiar with DCL, we convert and organize content to create electronic documents, populate databases, publish on the web, and basically get it ready for tomorrow's technology. Next slide, please. DCL services help you refine your document conversion strategy, identify document redundancy, extract metadata, and transform legacy and future documents for real needs, today and in the future. Next slide, please. We serve a broad client base. Next slide, please. Spanning all industries. Next slide, please. Here is the Rockley Group's life science client base. Today we are thrilled to introduce Ann Rockley, CEO of the Rockley Group. Ann has been helping medical devices, pharmaceutical, and healthcare providers create intelligent content strategies and adopt structured content management for more than 15 years. She has helped clinical, labeling, and marketing content teams to meet the increasing demands of regulatory requirements, complexities, of globalization, and growing reliance on mobile devices. Known as the mother of content strategy, she has introduced the concept with a best-selling book, Managing Enterprise Content, a Unified Content Strategy. Ann has an MIS from the University of Toronto and is a fellow of the STC. Without further ado, welcome Ann.
Thank you, Adam. Just to summarize, this is the second in a series that we've been doing on different types of standards for medical devices. In the last one, we talked about UDI and SPL. So just as a quick refresher, essentially when we're talking about UDI, that's the unique device identification. And this is a new standard from the FDA, and it is part of HL7. And it just essentially is a number, an identification on the device and on the product label. Now when we think back to SPL, Standard Product Labeling, that was originally developed for the pharmaceutical industry. And it was a way to share information about the pharmaceutical product that organizations were producing. So they were able to track that information. And these have come together in the Good ID, that's the GUDID, they pronounce it Good ID, where we're getting the same kind of information but obviously relevant to a medical device. So the Good ID is now that listing that is being provided, and it's exclusive to medical devices, whereas SPL can be used, is absolutely focused on pharmaceutical, but it can as well be used for medical devices.
Hi, Ann. While you're changing your slide, can you just expand your slides? They seem to be a little cut off.
They are full screen for me. Let me just... It's not going to get any bigger unless I change my resolution. Is the text getting cut off?
Yes, at the right-hand side.
Okay, let me see what I can do here. 1 second. Apologies, folks. I am going to, let's see. Oh, it's always so much fun to do this. It's probably my display resolution. Actually, I know what I may do. Let me do this. Where? Okay. I'll give it a second. It's I unhooked from my external monitor, and it should be just taking a second here too. Can you see my full screen? At the moment I'm not in full screen mode, but you should be able to see the... Okay, full screen mode just came up.
No, it's still cut off.
It's still cut off. All right. This is strange because it didn't happen last time. Let me, if you don't mind, I will stop sharing for one moment because it is faster for me to change resolutions. Okay, I am re-sharing my screen. And back to the PowerPoint. How is that?
It's still being cut off.
I've gone on down on full resolution size. This is very odd. I will try one more time, folks. Bear with me. Okay, I am going to try it one more time. I've gone down yet another resolution size. So let's give a second here. How is that?
Nothing's changed.
Nothing's changed. So I have no idea what the issue is. I will give control back to you. If you would share my version of the slides, then I'll just ask you to change the screens.
Sure. Just give me one moment. Okay. Whenever you're ready.
Okay. Okay. So you should have control now.
Okay. Do you see my screen?
I do.
Okay.
And it looks fine to me. Okay, everyone, let's hope this works. You'd think it was a Monday. Anyway, so if we go into what is good ID, which, so as I mentioned, the good ID is critical information about the device. So it has lots of information about, who makes it, or what type of device is it, the characteristics of the particular device, what status is it in, has it gone through what approval cycles, those sorts of things. what the storage and handling is for the device, all sorts of things like that. So essentially what you're doing is you're sharing data with the FDA about your information. Next slide. Okay. And I always get a delay when you run the slides. Right. So it's all about the data. And as I said, with a good ID, as with, UDI, SPL, it's all about the data that you're sharing with the FDA. And these kinds of standards are also being picked up by global regulatory information. And what we want to be able to do with our content is make it data-like as well. Next screen. So the image I'm showing here, which is similar to what I showed in the last presentation, is a sample label. It's got my name on it because we can't show our client materials. But with that, you've got a basic label. So on the next slide, it shows what these pieces of information are on the label. And all of the information that you see here in terms of the callouts is actually UDI data fields. But as we can see with the label, it's content. They're one and the same. So when we think about an actual package label, it's pretty obvious. We got really tiny little pieces of information, and it is fairly easy to envision that as data. So if we go beyond that in the next slide, this is actually an instructions for use. And if we look at the IFU, we have a lot of common information. So this is the first page of a typical IFU, and you can see the callouts for that information. Next slide. And on the back page, we also typically have the same information that you would have on the package label that you would have in UDI. And so we're seeing that information is common. And one of the problems that we typically see with most organizations is that they've got one spot for the UDI content, and that's, being stored in some database somewhere. And then they're producing their package labels, and it's being stored somewhere else, and it's typically, being driven by something on the manufacturing floor. But the instructions for use is managed yet somewhere else. So next slide. If we can structure all of our content, we can ensure that our content can be treated like data in every instance. And we can either, as some of our clients have done, move towards a single database or content management system for that content, and then it pushes it out to all of the different areas. Or we can have handoffs. So we can structure our content beyond the standard information that's required by UDI. And that's what this image is showing you here. These are sort of section-based or topic-based components of information in the IFU. Next slide. And in this information, showing again the last page, we can also have very tiny pieces of content. So these are the references, often called citations, that we refer to throughout the IFU, and they get referred to in a variety of other documents. But it makes sense to have very small modules of information for these citations. Next slide. So why would we want to even look at our content as data? Well, when we have content that's data, it's not locked into some big document. Most of the time, the IFUs that I just showed you are in a Microsoft Word document. Adam, I think you're still unmuted. I'm just hearing a little bit of background noise. So they're often in a Microsoft Word document, or even more common, we will see it in an InDesign document. And when it's locked in these two types of formats, or any other kind of format you might have, it's really hard to do anything with that content. And I find that organizations go through really difficult processes when they're even doing something as simple as updating that content, let alone reusing that content in related products and things like that. So one of the key things when we're moving to our content in a structured data-like manner is that we're making our content agile. That means it's nimble. We can do a lot of things very quickly with that information. We can manipulate it. So the IFU could look one way for one product. It can look entirely different for another product, but it's exactly the same structure. And we're seeing more and more with our clients that customers are pushing out, yes, your traditional print sort of PDF-based information, but an IFU could be like a manual. And that IFU could appear, PDF, could appear on the web, could also appear in mobile. So we can manipulate it. We can ensure that we have that single source of truth. I cannot tell you how many times the organizations that we work with have gotten into problems because content gets changed in one place. Let's say it got changed for the package label, but it didn't get changed in the IFU, and it didn't get changed in some other location. And so you've got these inconsistent materials. So you can have that single source of truth. We can also easily find and retrieve that information. And with that, when we are finding and retrieving it, we are wanting to look for content. Content on, again, some of the issues we see where content people are circulating it for review, and they're circulating it in email. And it's like, do I have the latest version of this? I had a phone call yesterday. It's like, do we have the latest content? Are we looking at this correct? Is that the right one for translation? That sort of thing. We can easily find it and retrieve it. And then, as I said earlier, we can automatically publish it to a variety of different outputs. So we can publish it to the web, we can publish it to print, we can publish it to mobile, because we can manipulate this content. Next slide, please. So what are the benefits that are then associated with this? Well, I already talked to a certain extent about the content being agile. And when we think about agile in the traditional sense, where agile is a process which was originally developed for the software field in order to more quickly create, test, and ensure that software was working, they broke it down into what are called sprints. So the sprints are smaller chunks, and the content is obviously tied to those sprints, to the chunks that are getting produced at that point. We can do the same thing as well with our life sciences content. A lot of content is reused over and over and over again, so that content can remain the same. But we can have pieces which are iterating throughout the process as you go through different validation cycles, as you go through different usability tests, so that content can be iterated. You can also have smaller chunks, those modules of information, being iterated based on a different regional requirement. It can be an entirely different module. It could be a single module in which you have tagged it to say this is appropriate for the U.S. and this is appropriate for EMA, those sorts of things. So we can really make our content agile, which in the way that is so very manual today with a lot of organization, it is definitely not agile. We can reduce the cost of globalization. So we're looking at translation. Again, if our content is modular, if our content is structured, we're going to reduce the cost of translation. Some of that content has already been translated for another use, possibly a previous version or used in a related product. So again, obviously that doesn't have to get translated again. But going back to Agile, if we are sure of different aspects of the product, and we can start to translate smaller modules of content so that we can translate it on a topic-based scenario. So instead of waiting for everything to be done at the end, we can do it along the way. That doesn't mean, though, that a translator is just translating an individual topic. What they're doing is they're looking at that topic in the context of a larger piece, maybe a section, maybe a chapter if it's a big IFU, a manual like IFU, an operations guide for someone, a patient guide, those sorts of things. But they can still get a head start on it, and that reduces costs and it reduces time. We find with some companies that they do start the translation process earlier, but using older methodologies where they're translating documents as opposed to modules or components of information, then they have to go back and retranslate that content. We're finding a lot less retranslation costs. There's also reduced risk. This is a really big one with medical device companies, all life sciences companies, because so much of your product and the content that is associated with it is associated with reducing risk. We don't want any errors in the content and the accuracy. We want to ensure that the content is correct and readable and effective and everything else. And if we can ensure that we have that single source of truth, we can ensure that every single time a certain statement is used, we're saying it the same way. Every single time a typical claim might be used, you know, it's 2 times faster, 4 times less painful, more accurate, whatever those sorts of things are that are being used in your content, we can ensure that they're exactly the same and that all the supporting information about that content is directly related to that piece of content, so that anywhere it's used, it is correct and up to date. And if we have to change something at the end, you know, the 11th hour, which certainly does happen, certainly if you have built-in software, those sorts of things that go into the device, they can happen later on in the cycle. We can ensure that it's correct. We can ensure that it's correct everywhere it appears. It's accurate, and that reduces risk. We've had a number of clients show that they've been able to reduce risk using their content in a very structured manner, and of course using it within a structured content management system that can track it and have an audit trail. The other thing that we find in terms of structuring our content and managing it more rigorously is optimized resources. This is not to say that you know, we're reducing resources. Absolutely not. But what we're doing is, I find when we go into an organization, is that the employees, the people are working flat out as hard as they can possibly work in order to ensure that it's accurate, that it's correct, that it's up to date, that it's this, that it's that, that it's the other thing. To do their jobs, they're working overtime, they're working nights, they're working weekends, that sort of thing, to absolutely ensure these things. Well, if we can take that burden away such that we can guarantee that the content is being controlled more rigorously and that the content is accurate, that we do have the way of validating that throughout the process, then we can optimize the resources. So instead of working all the overtime, they're working normal hours, but in fact, they're able to do more with the same resources. So we're finally able to free these resources to be much more effective in what they do on a day-to-day basis, and everybody is looking at content with you know, very fresh eyes, as opposed to seeing things over and over and over and over again as they see it iterate throughout the processes. So optimized resources is really key to successful content. Next slide. So how do we turn this content into data? What do we do with it? So I'm going to talk in more detail about each of these, but just as a top level, we're going to modularize it. We need to name it. We need to structure it, and we need to tag it. Next slide. So what do we mean in terms of modularization? The first thing that we need to do is to chunk it into modules. And when we're chunking it into modules, we look at content from many, many different perspectives. The first chunk, the easiest, the most logical, the clearest way of chunking that information is with section size modules, say in an IFU. So every time you've got a title, boom, chop, that's a module. And it could be a second level head, a third level head, that sort of thing. So those make logical modules. But we might also break it down to more granular modules, more like what I showed you with the UDI. Next slide. And I'm going to show you some examples, by the way, of some of those sections as we go along. It's not enough to just chunk this content down. As I mentioned earlier with the good ID, each of those pieces of content, that data is named. So you know exactly what it is. It's for single use. That is exactly what that field is in the database. Well, we have to do the same sort of thing with our content, and we have to name it very, very consistently. So it could be things like indications. It could be contraindications. It could be precautions, warnings, all sorts of different types of information, storage and handling, the references, those sorts of things. So we name the sections, those modules of information, so that once they're in your structured content management system, you can easily retrieve it. But then, again, it's not enough just to name it. We have to do more. So next slide, please. We also have to be able to structure it. And so when we structure it, we've got these modules, and we say this is how the content comes together to create something. We call it an information product model. So I'm just showing you an example here for an IFU. And what we're saying is if inputting, and this is a truncated, because I couldn't show everything, it's just a little bit of the whole thing. But if we're putting together an IFU, what are all of those named modules that have to go into it? So we could have a product name. That would be a fairly small granular object. The model number would also be small, granular object. We might have the single-use statement, a product description. There might be the actual directions for use, which is typically a task. We would have the storage and handling. We would have the symbol table. We would have all the information about the manufacturer, the copyright, the customer contact, a part number that would go on this IFU. Next slide, please. And here's an example of a more granular module. And what I'm showing here is a single-use statement. I was working with an organization a little over a year ago, and we found 6 different versions of the single-use, what we call the single-use statement. So in the good ID, they've named it. It's called for single use. In the symbol that goes along with it is the information, the symbol that you see there, the 2 with a slash through it. Now, in the U.S., you can't just use the symbol on its own. It's not yet an accepted standard symbol for FDA. So you typically have to have a statement that goes along with it. So what is that statement? In this case, we've used single use. Some companies have settled on a more descriptive single use statement, which might be for single use only. But whatever it is, we standardize on one. And there may be this small version that I'm showing you here that might appear on the package label because you don't have a lot of space on one of those labels, whereas in the actual IFU, you might have the longer statement. But this is an example of a granular module. Next slide, please. So it's not enough to just name it. So I was saying earlier, we had indications, contraindications, precautions, warning. Well, you might have dozens and dozens and dozens. One company I was working with last year had over 600 products. That's a lot of different indications. So we have to tag it. We have to add metadata to our content to ensure that we can find exactly the one that we want. So product is typically a very common piece of metadata that we would add to this information. You might have region, so it's part of the EU, it's part of the UK, it's part of North America, it's part of the US only. You know, those sorts of things. And language. And language can vary based on region and as well as just language. So we could have Spanish, say, for example. Well, you might have Spanish as in Spain Spanish, so that's tied to the region. And you might also have language in terms of Spanish, in terms of Brazilian, et cetera, et cetera. So we have language which is tied to region. And you would have a variety of different ways of tagging your content. So then again, when you are looking for a particular piece of information, you can find it. So we're making our content even more data-like by really adding all this additional information to it so we can tell exactly what it is so we can do something with it. Next slide, please. So how do you get there? And again, I will talk to each of these. But this is typically the process that we go through with a content audit, content models, a reuse strategy, and metadata strategy. So next slide, please. With the content audit, we really sit down and scrutinize the content. We typically get together, and you do it the same way. You get together in a room. We either have printed versions of content, or we project, and I love to have 2 projectors in the room. Often drives our clients crazy. 2? One's not enough? No, 2. So that we can be seeing content side by side, up and without having to kill a lot of trees. We can look at all sorts of different variations of content. We try to pick the most recent representative samples of the content because obviously content changes over time, and you make changes and corrections and those sorts of things. So whatever is the most recent and the most representative of the way you would like it to be, we compare it across products. So we take a look at it for product A and we take a look at it for product B. Obviously the content in the middle is different because they're different products, but we look to say, well, how are we using that single-use statement? And if the products are related, so they're in the same family, a particular disease state, you know, maybe for cancer treatment or something like that, are the precautions and warnings consistent? You know, are we saying the same things in both places? There may be some that are unique to a product, but there's often a bunch of them that are in common. So we look across the products. We also look across the business units. So there may be, you maybe have one group who's, you know, doing pacemakers, and you've got another group doing glucometers, and another group doing insulin pumps, and, you know, you could have many different areas. And while they may probably have their own labeling group, we do also look across the board to see what is happening across the business units, because this is all your content, and it's all going to the same regulatory agencies, and it may be going to hospitals that are using multiple types of devices from you. They may be going to physicians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you may even have patients, say in the case of an insulin pump and a glucometer, they may have both, in making sure that the content is consistent between the business units. And then we also compare across the different types of content. So we'll look at IFUs, be they small, 4-page, 8-page, 10-page, right up to the really big ones. They're often maybe software related, something like that. They might be 100 pages, so they're more manual-like. Or you might have something that's more like a patient's guide where lots of pictures showing them how to use a glucometer, things like that. And we take a look across the board, the IFU, the package label, any inserts, whatever you happen to have, to see what you've got and where the content is being used, and is it identical? Is it similar? Why is it different? Can we standardize it? Or do we need variants? Like I was talking about the single-use statement, where you might have an actual physical statement, shorter, longer, depending upon where you're using it, that sort of thing. So you have to look at it all and look at it with fresh eyes and have different groups come into the room over time to take a look at it. Next slide, please. We then typically build a content model to go along with it. Again, this is small, simple, truncated version, but like I showed you, the structure, we call that semantic, which semantic means meaning. We say what kind of content it is. That's our base. It's a topic or something of that nature. How often we can have it? Well, you can only have one product name. You can only have one single-use statement. We might, however, have multiple tasks, that sort of thing. Where is it used? It's in the IFU. It's in the package label. Well, what kind of reuse is it? It's cross-product. It's across information product, so that's IFU versus label. We might add notes to it. So in the storage and handling, when it's on the package label, it's just the actual symbol. It's not the words that go along with it, that sort of thing. Partial, things like the symbol table. You might have a partial on the package label, but the whole thing in the IFU. Next slide, please. So we've taken a look at our content. We've developed our models. I started to indicate in the model where the reuse is. We need to figure out how we're going to reuse this content. Like, are we going to have a single source for our information? Are we going to have multiple sources, so the package label? Are we going to hand off between different sources? How are we going to make sure that it's always absolutely correct wherever it occurs? So we take a look at things and we say, are we going to do manual reuse? Manual reuse might be one of your authors saying, we've got a new product. It's based on product we've had for the last 2 years. So I want to start with that and reuse all the content that's the same. That's called manual. Versus automatic, what we often do in terms of automatic, we say, okay, this is what goes together in a package label. And it's this, and it's the model name and the model number and the UDI code, and it's this and that, it's the other thing. Those can be automatically populated. It does not take any human intervention to do that. Same thing with the IFU. If you know what the product is, you know what version of the product this is. Is it a global version? Is it a U.S.-specific version? That sort of thing. That could be automatically, you can populate a lot of the content. Maybe not all of it, but a lot of it. So that would be automatic. We take a look at, well, what types of reuse is it? Are we reusing whole topics, components, modules? Are we saying conditionally that in this topic that this paragraph is true in one situation and that in another one? One area we're often using conditions for is things like you might have a screen which on a glucometer showing 24-hour time in one area, one region, where it's 12-hour in another. But they're both in English, that sort of thing. So we might say tag it, so conditionally, when published, which is which. We might have a fragment of content, a very small piece of content, kind of like that statement that we might pull into a variety of different places. We might have a variable, and millimoles versus milligrams, so we could have a variable there. How small are we going to chunk these things? We try not to get too small, but the reality is there's a lot of really, really good content in your materials that if it could be chunked fairly small, like I showed that for that single-use statement, it's going to be so much more powerful. You can automatically build symbol tables. You can build all sorts of stuff with that. Whereas if it was big and you had the whole symbol table, you couldn't do that. You had to copy and paste it out and put it here, that sort of thing. So we try to keep big, but where it makes sense, we go small. We just make sure that we manage it effectively. We also want to have a reuse governance. And with that, what we're doing is ensuring that all the content that is used and reused is very carefully controlled. So if we think of the situation where I said the client earlier they had reduced risk, one of the things that they did was they identified certain types of content within their materials that could only be changed by a certain group. And I mean, obvious groups are like regulatory, legal, that sort of thing. But there were also subgroups that they had identified, like a product owner, that sort of thing. And they were able to show that if the content was locked down, they could reduce risk. And the situation that they had is where somebody tried to change a statement that was FDA approved, and we're saying, no, you can't change this for this reason, then it would say, no, this content can't be changed. They actually had a situation like that where somebody did change that, put them out of their compliance, and it cost them millions. So this way they could say, no, 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 you can't change that. It is signed off by, FDA, all the different regulatory agencies. That's not to say that content doesn't change over time. If it needs to be updated, it does. But it's not arbitrarily changed. It's not subjectively changed, which sometimes happens. And it may be totally inadvertent, but it could be very serious. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we have a metadata strategy, and again, this is just a partial, not necessarily specific, but you could say who's our audience for the information, healthcare professionals, a hospital, a consumer, what's our geography, what's our language. We could have different versions, as you can see, of English, US or UK, French. You can have French as in France and French as in Canada, etc. Who has control over this content? Is it patent information? Is it license information? What kind is it? What legal information? How about who owns the claim? And so they're changing it. What's the claim ID? What are the measures for the content that we're trying to track? Next slide, please. So in summary, structuring all of our content results in our content being managed just like we manage data, just like UDI, just like Good ID, just like SPL. It just makes our content so much more effective because we can manipulate it. We can ensure we have a single source of truth. We can easily find and retrieve it. We can automatically publish it to the web, print, or mobile. Next slide, please. We can ensure and receive the benefits that our content is more agile. We can iterate it much more quickly. We can ensure that it's correct. We can reduce the costs of globalization. We can reduce risk. We can optimize our resources. There's a lot that we can get out of making sure that our content is structured, modular, tagged, named, etc., and treated like data. And we build it just like we would manufacture a product, we pull our content together in exactly the same way when it's designed this way. Next slide, please. So I'm open to questions now. If you have some questions, by all means, put them in the chat window. And Adam, if you could share a couple of those with me.
I'm just waiting for some to come in, but in the meantime, thank you, Anne, for this very informative webinar.
Thank you for handling the snafu and for everyone participating. It's always something.
We'll just give it a couple of moments, folks. So if you have any questions, please provide them in the question area. And while we're waiting, just want to let everyone know that this webinar will be available in our archive section of our website, which is located at www.dclab.com. And the next webinar is scheduled for next Thursday, February 12th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, titled Out of the Silos and Into the Farm, being presented by Molly Mesabov, content strategist. So, Anne, this time I haven't received any questions. How much longer do you want to?
Well, that's fine. If there's no questions from anyone, that's great. Hopefully I was clear. And, you know, if you think of anything after the webinar, anything specific, if you send those in, then I'm happy to answer them.
We got the first question.
There you go.
And the question is, in your experience, where have companies been the most resistant to structuring content as data?
Well, there's a couple of different areas where we found resistance. One is it really is dependent upon who are the people who are creating the content. And some teams, like some organizations, have a labeling team that work with subject matter experts throughout the organization, making sure that they gather the correct information and put it together. And in other cases, the task of creating content actually falls to the subject matter experts. So maybe somebody in clinical, somebody in regulatory, somebody in engineering, areas like that. And they're fairly comfortable with marking up a PDF, usually of the InDesign document, but they've never really thought of content in a structured way. And so one of the things that we work really hard on is to ensure that there's a very easy way for subject matter experts either to create unique content, to comment on content, so having really good collaborative reviews, making it possible to do it as simply as possible. We do not in any way want to force them to use tools, you know, that are typically associated with structured content, you know, XML editors or you know, things like that. We try to make it as simple as possible. So they might work with forms. They might work with something that just looks like a Word document on the surface and is structured under the covers and provides them with authoring guidance. So that is one main area where we have seen resistance, and it's a big focus of ours to really ensure that we can work with our subject matter experts effectively. Another area of resistance that we have seen, and it's not so much resistance, you know, to creating content as data per se, but it's more around, oh, it's going to cost us something to do it this way, and yes, you can't do this with Microsoft Word or InDesign. So yes, there absolutely are new tools that are required. There's new design processes. There's also getting sign-off from some of these subject matter experts that, yes, we're going to say that warning this way. We may have had 10 different ways of saying it before, but yes, we're all going to come together and say it in that one way. So it's building a really good business case and an ROI to help organizations to understand where the savings will be, not just in you know, the sort of basic creating and publishing the content, but to the organization, to the customer, to the bottom line as a whole. And so when you put together a really good business case and ROI, we typically find that the resistance is lessened.
Excellent. Thank you, Anne. The next question that's come in is, can you speak more on how you determine granularity?
Well, when we look at granularity, one of the things that we try to look at, as I said, you're in this room and you're looking at the content, and we try to say, okay, where is the content identical? Where is it similar? If it's similar, could it be identical? Hey, could 99.9% of it be identical if we made this one piece of information smaller, like a variable, something a little bit more granular? If we could do that, could the majority of the content be the same? So that's one way. We say, okay, we really want to consider, maybe it's a product name. Maybe it's, as I said, those measurements, millimoles versus milligrams. You know, is there some way that we could do that? Because, you know, it costs us X to have all these different variations and make sure it's correct, and it's correct in all the languages, and yada, 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 yada. Are there real benefits of doing that? The other is we try to see where that content is reused. And while many companies, when they're looking at their content, maybe look at the IFUs and package inserts and things like that, they're not looking at the box, and they're not necessarily looking at the package label. When you look at the package label and you look at the box and things like that, they're really granular. And we say, is there an opportunity to share our content out to these other deliverables? And if there is, then hey, we have to get a whole lot more granular, because obviously they've got a lot less space. They're dealing with very small pieces of content.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Anne. That's been all the questions been asked so far. So with that being said, I'd like to thank you again for this wonderful presentation. And I would like to thank everyone for attending this webinar. This will conclude today's broadcast, and you will be able to access the recorded version in the webinar archive section of our website, which is located at www.dclab.com.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Adam.
You're welcome. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.